He stood behind the checkout counter for 5 years, offering smiles to strangers who barely looked up. His name tag said Marcus, but few bothered to read it. He remembered their coffee preferences, their kids' names, the stories they dropped between coupons and receipts. And yet, most days he left work unseen, underpaid, overworked, and invisible. Until one night, when he helped a man short on change, thinking it was just another small act of kindness in a world too busy to care. But what Marcus didn't know was that this man wasn't just another tired customer. He was the CEO of one of the largest grocery chains in the country. And that small moment at the register, it would flip an entire empire on its head and change 2 lives forever. Because sometimes it's the quietest kindness that speaks the loudest. And it all started here, with one familiar chime above a grocery store door. Marcus had stood behind the checkout counter of Brooklyn Market for over 5 years, his smile as much a fixture of the store as the faded linoleum floors or the squeaky entrance bell. Rain or shine, paycheck to paycheck, he greeted each customer like an old friend, by name, with warmth and a kind word. The job didn't come with perks or praise. His rent was always a week away from being late, and sometimes dinner meant skipping a meal to stretch what little he had. But still, he showed up. Because for Marcus, it wasn't about money. It was about dignity. About believing that every person deserved to feel seen, even if it was just for the few minutes it took to bag their groceries. He learned the quirks of the regulars, remembered who liked paper over plastic, who had trouble with pin pads, who came in just for conversation. To the world, he was just a cashier. But to the neighborhood, he was steady, present, proof that kindness hadn't gone extinct. And that night, as a stranger stepped through the door with shoulders heavy and eyes downcast, Marcus didn't know yet. His quiet kindness was about to be tested in a way that would change everything. Just a few blocks away from Atlanta's glowing skyline, where high-rises blinked with ambition and the streets pulsed with the rush of deadlines, sat a little corner store tucked between an old laundromat and a pawn shop. Brooklyn Market wasn't flashy. Its neon sign buzzed with a faint flicker, the windows smudged with fingerprints of everyday life. Inside, the aisles were narrow, the shelves slightly crooked, and the tiles worn thin from years of foot traffic. But to the neighborhood, it was a place of rhythm and routine, of familiarity and faces they knew. The scent of brewed coffee and floor cleaner mixed in the air, oddly comforting in its constancy. Children ran through its aisles after school, seniors came in just to chat, and blue-collar workers grabbed dinner on their way home. It was imperfect, but it was alive. And at the center of it all was Marcus, hands steady on the scanner, eyes always alert to who might need more than just groceries that day. So when the door chimed and the autumn air crept in, carrying with it a man whose presence felt out of place, Marcus instinctively looked up, because in this store, noticing people was what he did best. The door creaked shut behind him, but the man didn't move right away. He stood in the entryway, shoulders hunched beneath a threadbare coat, his beanie pulled low as if to hide from the world. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the floor, and Marcus watched from behind the counter, sensing that hesitation, the kind born not of indecision, but of fear. The man's eyes flitted across the store, never landing on anything for too long. He didn't belong to this neighborhood, and yet he didn't seem foreign either. More like someone who had once belonged, and lost his way back. He moved quietly down the nearest aisle, touching nothing at first. Then he reached for a pack of instant noodles, paused to examine the price on a small bottle of milk, and finally picked out a protein bar, the cheapest one. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched the 3 items, walking slowly toward the register. Marcus noticed how he walked with a kind of practiced smallness, as if trying not to take up space. As he placed the items on the counter, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill and a few scattered coins. His eyes stayed low as though he already knew the total would be too high. "I'll just put the bar back," the man mumbled, sliding it aside with care, like even that small act cost him something. Marcus didn't flinch. He'd seen this kind of quiet struggle too many times. With a practiced motion, he scanned all 3 items anyway, the protein bar included. "Don't worry about it," he said softly, sliding the bag toward him. "We all need a little help sometimes." The man looked up then, truly looked, like someone who hadn't been offered kindness in a long, long time. But Marcus didn't ask questions. He just offered a smile. And in that moment, something inside the man began to stir, something that hadn't stirred in years. For a long second, the man just stood there, staring down at the brown paper bag like he didn't quite believe it was his. His fingers hovered over the edge, hesitant, as if it might disappear the moment he touched it. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it, holding it close to his chest like it contained not groceries, but something far more precious. Dignity, perhaps, or a memory of how it felt to be treated like he mattered. "Thank you," he said, the words brittle and unused like they'd been buried beneath years of silence. His voice cracked halfway through and he cleared his throat, embarrassed. You have no idea what this means." Marcus just nodded, easy and warm. "Take care out there," he said, as though they'd shared nothing more than casual small talk, not a quiet moment of rescue. The man gave a small nod in return, his face unreadable but his eyes suddenly alive with something. Shock, maybe even suspicion, like he was waiting for the catch, the judgment, the price to be named, but none came. Only Marcus, already turning to scan the next customer's groceries as though kindness was just part of the job. The man turned toward the door, his steps slower now, steadier. As he stepped back into the cold night, he clutched the bag like a lifeline, unaware that someone was still watching him, someone who had seen more than he realized, and who was carrying far more than just groceries out into the dark. Stephen Langford sat in his car just across the street, the brown bag nestled in the passenger seat like a relic from a life he'd nearly forgotten. The engine idled quietly, headlights off, while the city's nighttime hum drifted through the cracked window. He hadn't planned this visit, hadn't intended to walk into a small, unfamiliar store as just another face with an empty wallet, but tonight wasn't about plans. His fingers played absent-mindedly with the edge of the receipt, still warm from the register. His mind wasn't on the food. He could afford feasts in 5-star hotels. No, his thoughts were back at the counter, replaying the moment that had caught him completely off guard. The way the young man hadn't blinked before stepping in to help, hadn't flinched at the tattered coat or weathered face, hadn't looked at him with either pity or scorn. Stephen had built an empire. Langford Foods was one of the largest grocery chains in the country, and yet lately it had all felt hollow. But standing in that humble store, in front of a cashier who didn't know or care about who he was, something shifted. He hadn't felt it in years, this strange sense of being humbled, of being seen, not for his title, but for his need. And though Marcus didn't know it, his small act had cracked something open in a man who had once started with nothing, and maybe, somewhere along the way, had lost sight of everything. The night pressed in around him, fog clinging to the windshield as Stephen sat motionless, his breath leaving faint clouds on the glass. He hadn't felt this way in decades, unsettled, raw, exposed. The man who had once clawed his way from poverty to prestige now found himself undone by a $2 protein bar and the unspoken grace of a stranger behind a register. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't in a leather-seated car anymore. He was 16 again, pedaling uphill through rain with grocery bags dangling from his handlebars, soaked through, hands numb, stomach growling. Back then, no one noticed him. He was invisible, just another poor kid trying not to fall behind. But he remembered the rare times someone had shown kindness. A free banana from a grocer, a sandwich from a tired cashier who said, "Don't tell my manager." He hadn't forgotten. He had just buried it. That night at Brooklyn Market had unearthed something. It wasn't the money, the groceries, or the gesture. It was the look in Marcus's eyes. The quiet certainty that helping was the only option, not a performance. It reminded Stephen of who he used to be before the boardrooms, the profits, the spreadsheets, before he'd learned to calculate everything and feel nothing. He looked at the receipt again, then slowly folded it and slid it into his coat pocket as though it were something worth keeping. Because maybe it was. Maybe it was the first real thing he'd held on to in years. And as he shifted into drive, pulling away from the curb, a quiet truth gripped his chest. He hadn't just stumbled into that store, he'd been drawn there, drawn back to something he didn't know he'd lost. As the car merged into the slow churn of city traffic, Stephen couldn't shake the feeling in his chest, that aching blend of guilt and clarity. He had spent years building Langford Foods from the ground up, brick by brick, policy by policy, convinced that growth meant success. And it had, on paper at least. The company was thriving, storefronts multiplying, profit margins climbing, shareholders smiling. But something had gone missing along the way. Something vital. In the boardrooms, they talked about quarterly earnings and expansion strategy. In the emails, they reviewed efficiency reports and supply chain metrics. But no one talked about the people. The faces behind the registers, the hands stocking shelves at 3 a.m., the single moms balancing shifts and school pickups, the elderly clerks working past retirement just to keep their lights on. Somewhere along the way, the soul of the company had been traded for spreadsheets. There had been rumors, of course, internal memos about employee burnout, customer complaints about cold service, whispers of managers who ran stores like fiefdoms. But Stephen had stopped listening. Or maybe he'd convinced himself someone else would deal with it. Now he couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow what Marcus had shown him, that somewhere out there in the stores that bore his name, good people were carrying the weight he no longer felt. And worse, some were doing it under the heel of managers who didn't see them at all. The thought stung. Not because it was new, but because it was familiar. He had seen this before, in other companies, other CEOs. He had just never imagined he'd become one of them. And as the red light turned green, Stephen realized something else. It wasn't too late. Not yet. But it soon could be. The next evening, Stephen found himself once again standing across the street from Brooklyn Market. This time, there was no hesitation, no disguise. He wore the same worn coat, not out of pretense, but because he didn't want to interrupt what was real. He needed to see it again, to be sure that what he'd felt wasn't some fleeting sentimentality. He needed proof that Marcus was the kind of man his company had forgotten to reward. Inside, the store looked no different. The shelves were still crammed, the overhead lights still buzzed with that faint hum, and the air still carried the scent of brewed coffee and citrus disinfectant. But there was a warmth here, one that didn't exist in corporate headquarters, and it radiated from Marcus. Stephen moved slowly through the aisles, pretending to browse. He watched as Marcus greeted an elderly man by name, helped him count his coins without a hint of impatience. A few minutes later, he stepped away from his register to assist a young mother wrestling a cart and 2 toddlers, lifting a heavy bag of dog food into her trunk with quiet grace. Then, when a nervous teen came in with a hoodie pulled low and eyes darting toward the exit, Marcus rang him up with ease and subtly added a small bag of chips to the order, free of charge. The teen froze, confused, then muttered a soft, "Thanks," before slipping out the door. And in that moment, Stephen saw it again, that instinctive generosity, the kind that asked for nothing in return. It wasn't policy, it wasn't training, it was Marcus. And as Stephen lingered near the freezer aisle pretending to examine frozen peas, he knew with absolute certainty this man had given more in 10 minutes than some of his store managers had in months. Stephen was about to leave when the store's front door swung open with a jarring clatter, and walked a man wearing a cheap gray suit and too much cologne, his blonde hair slicked back with an arrogance that entered the room before he did. Stephen stiffened. He knew the type, corporate middle managers who dressed the part but lacked the soul. and this one wore his self-importance like a badge. The man strode past the waiting line without a word and planted himself at the counter like he owned the place. A woman and her son stepped back instinctively, startled by his presence. Marcus, ever composed, didn't react. He quietly finished ringing up an elderly woman's groceries, even helping her bag them and walking around the counter to hand her purse. Only then did he turn to the newcomer. "Evening, Mr. Coyle," Marcus said, tone respectful but cool. Coyle didn't respond with a greeting. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, tossing it onto the counter like trash. "Payroll update," he said flatly. "Per corporate, no raises this quarter. Lock it in." Marcus's fingers hesitated for the briefest second as he unfolded the memo. Stephen noticed it. A subtle tightening of the jaw, a blink that lasted half a second too long. Then Marcus nodded. "Understood," he replied, his voice level. Coyle smirked, leaning in just slightly. "Didn't think you'd push back. Smart. Some of your kind don't know when to quit." The sentence landed like a slap. Stephen's blood ran cold. Every syllable dripped with condescension. No, something uglier, something targeted, something calculated. The store went quieter, the customers pretending not to hear, but their eyes flicked toward the front like magnets. Everyone had heard, and Marcus, he didn't flinch. He met the insult head-on with quiet restraint, eyes steady as steel. "Anything else, sir?" he asked, his voice like glass, smooth, but one breath from shattering. Coyle straightened, shrugged. "Just thought I'd deliver the news personally. Better than another rejection email, right?" He chuckled at his own comment, then turned and strutted out, his shoes clicking loudly on the tile like punctuation marks of contempt. Stephen stood frozen in place. He'd seen power abused before, had once been on the receiving end of it. But this was something different. It was quiet cruelty, institutionalized, polished, wielded with a smile and hidden behind paperwork. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply folded the memo, precisely like folding something that had just hurt him, and slid it under the register. His shoulders were straighter now, not out of pride but out of necessity, out of survival. Then, without missing a beat, he greeted the next customer. Stephen watched him, heart pounding, jaw tight. He had come looking for the soul of his company, and what he found was a man standing under fluorescent lights, carrying its weight with grace, and being crushed by it in silence. And in that moment, Stephen knew. This wasn't just a bad manager. This was a symptom of something far deeper, and it had his name on it. Stephen stood frozen between two shelves of canned vegetables, his fists clenched at his sides, heart pounding with a rage he hadn't felt in years. Not at Marcus. No, never at him, but at the man who had just walked out. At himself. At the realization that his empire, the very thing he had poured decades of his life into, was now represented by people like Coyle. He had told himself he'd built something different. A company with values, with heart. The press had praised him for it. Award plaques lined his office walls. But what he had just witnessed wasn't culture. It was rot. Rot that had been allowed to take root in boardrooms and regional offices while he looked away, distracted by numbers, awards, growth projections. And Marcus, this calm, dignified man who had done nothing but serve with quiet excellence, had just been humiliated like a child asking for too much. Stephen exhaled slowly, trying to breathe past the tightness in his chest. He watched Marcus return to work with mechanical grace, face composed, hands steady. But Stephen saw what others might miss. The shoulders drawn a little higher, the jaw held just a little too tight, the stiffness in his spine. The kind of posture born not from pride, but from years of learning to swallow unfairness like bitter medicine. And Stephen knew that posture. He had worn it himself once, when he was still young, still invisible to the men in the boardroom. Back when his ideas were laughed off, when his pay was half what he deserved, and he was told it was just how things worked. He had sworn he'd never let anyone make him feel that small again. And, more than that, he had promised to build a company where no one else would feel that way either. But promises were easy to forget when the stock price was up and everyone called you a visionary. Now, standing in a store with flickering lights and cracked floor tiles, Stephen felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not the shame of failure, but the shame of complicity. The shame of realizing that somewhere along the way, he had become the very thing he once swore to fight against. He didn't want an apology. He didn't want to fix this with a phone call or a memo. This couldn't be repaired with policy. This had to be burned down, ripped from the root, rebuilt with names, not numbers, with people, not profits. And in that moment, Stephen Langford made a promise, not the kind whispered in youth and forgotten with success, but one carved into the marrow of a man who had just remembered what he stood for. This wasn't going to end with a folded memo and a stiff upper lip. Something had to change, and it had to begin now. Stephen didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in his penthouse suite, staring at the ceiling as Coyle's voice echoed through the silence. Some of your kind don't know when to quit. The words weren't just offensive, they were corrosive, laced with history, entitlement, and the kind of casual cruelty that made decent men shrink to survive. And Stephen, for all his power, had stood there like a ghost watching it happen. By morning, his decision was no longer a question. It was a mission. At precisely 11 a.m., he walked into the Langford Foods corporate headquarters. The room full of executives turned their heads, surprised by his unannounced presence. Some straightened in their chairs. Others smiled nervously, already sensing the shift in the air. Stephen didn't sit. He stood at the head of the conference table, his voice calm but cold. I want payroll reports from every store in this region. I want to see who's been denied raises in the last 3 years and exactly who made those decisions. Silence. I want turnover rates. I want transcripts of employee complaints. I want internal surveys, exit interviews, customer service reports, everything. Someone cleared their throat. Sir, if this is about... Stephen cut him off with just a look. I wasn't finished. He stepped forward slowly, pressing his palms flat against the table. Starting today, we review every single regional policy. If I find even one that prioritizes profit over people, I'll start firing from the top down. And if any of you think this is a bluff, try me. His words settled like a storm cloud in the room. Executives exchanged glances, some pale, others indignant, but no one dared speak. Stephen leaned back, letting the silence stretch, then turned for the door. You have 24 hours, he said. Don't waste them. He didn't wait for a response. He had something more important to do, something real, something long overdue. And it started where everything had gone wrong, in a small market with flickering lights and a man behind the register who hadn't asked for anything but deserved everything. That evening, as the sky turned a dusky blue and the city lights blinked to life, Stephen stood once more outside Brooklyn Market. But this time, he wasn't hiding in shadows or watching from across the street. He stood tall beneath the flickering neon sign, the same worn coat on his shoulders, but the weight he carried now was different. He wasn't here as a mystery man with a hidden fortune. He was here as the man who held the power to make things right. Inside, the store was alive with the low hum of conversations, the clink of shopping baskets, and the familiar beeping of a scanner. It smelled the same, slightly stale but warm, a blend of cheap coffee, citrus cleaner, and human stories. He took a slow breath and stepped through the door. The bell chimed softly above him. Marcus was at the register, his back straight, his movements efficient. There was no trace of last night's insult in his demeanor, no lingering anger, no visible resentment, only the same quiet presence, the same calm he wore like armor. He was helping a mother with her toddler, sliding coloring books into her bag with care, offering the child a sticker from his pocket. Nothing in his face showed the bruises Coyle's words had surely left. Stephen watched him for a moment longer, a strange pride swelling in his chest. Then, as the last customer stepped away from the counter, their eyes met. There was recognition there. Marcus remembered him. Not with suspicion, not quite with curiosity either, but with the quiet awareness of someone who had already seen through the surface once before. Stephen walked toward the register, no longer an observer. Not tonight. Tonight he had something to say, and this time he wasn't going to leave without saying it. Marcus straightened slightly as Stephen approached, his expression unreadable but attentive. There was no smile this time, no casual greeting, just quiet focus, like he sensed something was about to shift. "Back again?" Marcus asked, voice steady, not unfriendly, just cautious. Stephen gave a small nod. "Figured I should actually pay for something this time." Marcus gave the faintest hint of a smirk, but he didn't reach for the scanner. Instead, he waited. Stephen could feel the question between them hanging like dust in the air. "Who are you, really?" Without another word, Stephen reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the counter gently, the weight of what it carried invisible but undeniable. Marcus glanced down and froze. His eyes moved slowly over the embossed name, Stephen Langford, CEO, Langford Foods Group. He blinked once, then again. When his gaze lifted, something in him had shifted. The easy posture, the openness, it retreated, replaced with a guarded tension. His jaw tightened, shoulders squared. It wasn't fear. It was a man instinctively bracing for whatever came next. Stephen didn't let the moment stretch too long. "I should have introduced myself properly that first night," he said softly. "But if I had, I might have never seen what I needed to see." Marcus didn't speak, didn't blink. He just stared, like he was suddenly standing at the edge of something he couldn't name. And Stephen knew that feeling all too well, because he had stood on that same edge only a few nights before. Stephen reached into his coat once more and pulled out a neatly folded document, sliding it across the counter next to the business card. "This," he said, voice level, "is an offer. A real one." Marcus didn't move to touch it, not right away. He looked from the paper to Stephen, still unsure of the rules of this conversation, still wondering if this was some elaborate test. "It's a corporate position," Stephen continued, calm but firm. "Community outreach, employee development. You'd be working directly with regional leadership to help rebuild the bridges we've burned, between the company and the people who actually make it run." Still, Marcus said nothing. "There's a real salary," Stephen added, "with benefits, a budget, and—" He paused for just a beat, letting the weight of the next words settle in. "Funds to finally get that cafe of yours off the ground." This time, Marcus's eyes flickered. The mask slipped just slightly. His fingers hovered above the paper now, not grabbing it, but touching the edge, like he needed to feel whether it was real. "How do you know about the cafe?" he asked quietly. Stephen smiled, not smugly, but with something gentler. "Because I listened. Because I saw a man who's been doing the work of 5 people, giving more than anyone's asked, and doing it with heart. And because someone like you shouldn't be stuck behind a register forever." Marcus's throat moved as he swallowed. His fingers closed around the paper slowly, carefully. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Why me?" Stephen exhaled, steady and sincere. "Because you remind me of the man I used to be, and the kind of man I should have been fighting for all along." The store around them hummed on, customers passing, carts rattling, but in that moment, none of it mattered, because something had shifted again, this time for both of them. Marcus didn't answer right away. He stood there, the offer in one hand, the business card still resting on the counter like it might vanish if touched again. His jaw moved slightly as if trying to shape a response, but the words took their time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but firm, grounded in something unshakable. "I didn't do it for a reward," he said. Stephen nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting it. "I know," he replied. "That's why you're the right man for the job." Marcus exhaled, a soft breath that seemed to carry years of unspoken struggle. His fingers smoothed the edges of the paper, not as someone desperate to grasp it, but as someone who understood the weight of what it meant. Not just the opportunity, but the responsibility that came with it. He looked back up, eyes steady, no longer guarded, but not wide open either. There was still a wall, but now a door had been cracked. "I've been here a long time," Marcus said, "and I've seen what happens when people think no one's watching. I stayed because someone had to make it feel human." Stephen met his gaze. "That's exactly why we need you." No handshake was exchanged, no dramatic acceptance or rejection. Just two men standing across a counter, one offering hope, the other not yet ready to trust it. But something passed between them anyway. Not an agreement, not yet, but a silent understanding that something had changed, and neither of them would walk away from this moment the same. Stephen nodded once, not pushing for more. He knew the decision wasn't his to make. He had extended the offer. Now it lived in Marcus's hands, where it belonged. He reached for his coat, pulling it tighter around his frame as he turned toward the door. The bell above the entrance gave its familiar chime, softer somehow tonight. The same store, the same sounds, but nothing felt the same. As he stepped outside, the cold night met him like a breath of clarity. He paused on the sidewalk, looking back through the glass. Marcus was still behind the counter, folding a receipt, helping a customer. Like always. But there was something different now. A tension eased, a thread loosened. Stephen didn't smile, but there was peace in his expression, a quiet satisfaction. Not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had finally remembered how. Just as he stepped off the curb, Marcus's voice called softly behind him. "I didn't help you because of who you were," he said. "I helped you because of who I am." Stephen turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Marcus's through the glass. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you're the one I came back for." And then he walked into the night, leaving behind a small market that still smelled like coffee and hope, carrying with him the weight of a name, and for the first time in a long while, the purpose to honor it. Because sometimes the richest lessons come not from wealth or titles, but from a cashier who simply chose to be kind. In a world obsessed with titles, wealth, and appearances, it's easy to forget the power of small, unseen acts. But sometimes it's the man behind the counter, the one who remembers your name, the one who pays attention when no one else does, who carries more integrity than a dozen boardrooms combined. Marcus didn't help that night because he expected a reward. He helped because that's who he was. Kindness wasn't a strategy, it was instinct. And Stephen, for all his riches and recognition, had to become invisible to see what he'd been blind to all along. The soul of his company wasn't in its spreadsheets. It was in its people. This story reminds us that respect doesn't trickle down from the top. It rises from the way we treat one another, face to face, moment by moment. So be the one who notices, the one who helps, the one who shows up with decency when no one's watching. Because in the end, true leadership doesn't wear a suit. It wears a name tag, a steady smile, and a heart that refuses to look away. If this story moved you, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like this video to spread the message, and subscribe for more stories that remind us kindness still matters.